Hello, everyone, and welcome to our online grant information session. My name is Sarah Zia, and I'm the program director here at the Leeway Foundation, and I'm being joined by an interpreter from the Deaf Hearing Communication Center. So thank you to DHCC for providing that service for us today. Today, we're going to be talking about what the Leeway Foundation funds, a little bit about who we are, and then I'll be talking more specifically about the Transformation Award, which is the next upcoming deadline on May 15th. During this broadcast, you can ask questions in two different ways. One is that if you're on Twitter, you can tweet at us and use the hashtag AskLeeway. Or you can email us a question at news, so that's NEWS, at leeway.org, LEEWAY.org. And I will answer your questions throughout the broadcast, so please send them in if you have any as I'm talking. So first, I want to start with just a little bit about who we are. The Leeway Foundation is a regional foundation that supports women, trans, and gender nonconforming artists who are living in the Delaware Valley area and using their art as a tool for social change. So we fund folks that are living in Bucks County, Camden, Chester, Delaware, Montgomery, and of course, Philadelphia. We only fund individuals. We do not fund organizations. And you must be at least 18 years old to apply. So there are three different funding opportunities that we offer here. One is called the Transformation Award, which I just mentioned. This is an unrestricted grant of $15,000. So it's not project specific and can be used for whatever you want that is going to move you forward as an artist. For that grant, you have to have been living in the Philadelphia area for at least 2 years, and you have to have been practicing your art form for at least 5 years. That deadline is once a year on May 15th, and as I mentioned, I'm going to be talking about that more in detail in a little bit, but first I just want to give an overview of the other grants that are available as well. The second funding opportunity we have is called the Art and Change Grant. This is a project-based grant of $2,500. So for this grant, you have to have a specific project in mind. The funding can be for the project overall, or it can be for a particular phase of the project. And you'll have to submit a budget, of course, that outlines the expenses for that project. And you also have to work with what we call a change partner. So that can be an individual or an organization that's essentially co-signing or endorsing the work that you are doing. So either speaking to the need for your work in that community or in that particular art form, that artistic discipline, or in a way vouching for you that of like how they trust you and will advise you in getting the project done. You can read more details about the change partners in the application. And since we're not focusing as much on the Art and Change Grant today, I won't say more, but you can ask questions if you have them. That deadline is twice a year. So the first deadline was March 1st and passed already. The next deadline is upcoming in August, on August 1st. And we will have another online info session shortly beforehand that will focus more in detail on that application. The third funding opportunity that we offer is called the Window of Opportunity Grant, or we call it the WOO for short, WOO. This is a grant that Leeway used to offer in the past and stopped, and then we've recently brought it back. This is only available to past grantees, so you have to have received a grant from us previously to be eligible. And this is a monthly rolling deadline, so it's the 15th of every month. And it's meant to fund opportunities that are immediate external opportunities that are not projects. So it can't be, for example, like I want to complete this project by a particular date, but that you have a clear external opportunity, maybe for a residency or for travel, or some sort of other opportunity to share your work, that you need maybe money for travel or money to frame your artwork or something else. And so this is meant to fund those kinds of particular opportunities. So for all of our grants, we're looking for how you are using your art as a tool for social change. And when we talk about social change here at Leeway, we are looking for art with a vision. So a lot of organizations, like there's funders that fund specifically just art, and there's funders that fund community organizing work, policy change. And we at Leeway are occupying what a colleague of mine referred to as the third space, right? So we're looking at people that are bridging the art and sort of community organizing world and recognizing the importance of culture in moving those social justice movements forward. And so there's a couple of different forms that could take. One is that maybe you're raising consciousness somehow through your artwork. Or you're working to alter how we think about ourselves or how we think about our society or culture at large. You're somehow working towards creating a vision of a more just world, right? Part of our role as artists and cultural producers is to model for the world how things could be different and how we could be in community together. You could be using your work as a tool or strategy for organizing and movement building. So perhaps you're working together closely with an organization maybe, but providing the cultural elements of that work. You could be doing work that's somehow questioning mainstream belief or cultures, or work that is reclaiming a traditional cultural practice that is being pushed out or devalued in some sort of way. So you're reclaiming it as an act of resistance, or maybe a way of community building so that people are able to build their power and be less marginalized. And generally also with your work that you're maybe somehow challenging the many different types of oppressions that exist out there in the world. I want to remind you that if you have any questions as you're watching, you can email questions to us at news, that's NEWS, at leeway.org. Or if you're on Twitter, you can tweet at us with any questions of anything you'd like me to go into more detail about. So as I mentioned, today we're going to focus on the Transformation Award, since that's the upcoming deadline soon on May 15th. If you haven't already looked at the application and you'd like to follow along while I'm talking, you can go to our website at leeway.org. And in the top left on the menu where it says Our Grants, you'll see options there for accessing the application. Some general information about the grant. So the deadline is May 15th for stage 1. The Transformation Award is a 2-stage process. In order to make it to stage 2, you have to be invited by the panel, and that deadline is in October. Usually somewhere between 60 to 80 people apply in stage 1, and then between 20 to 25 are invited to stage 2. Everybody gets feedback whether or not you're invited to stage 2. So you can also use that feedback if you're interested in applying again the next year to improve on your application. The staff here at Leeway is not at all involved in the decision-making process. So we bring in a panel of artists that work together through a consensus process to make the decisions about the applications. For the Transformation Award in particular, it's important to note that 2 of those 3 panelists in stage 1 are from out of town. They're not from Philadelphia or the Philadelphia area. And the reason I say that is because they may not have as much context for the Philadelphia area, so be sure that you're not making assumptions in your application, that they know the organizations you might mention, or even the dynamics or demographics of particular neighborhoods, if you mention those. So imagine as if you were speaking to someone who's from outside of Philadelphia. And then the other thing is that we do try to pick people from different artistic disciplines to be on the panel, but we can't guarantee that it's going to be someone who is from your artistic discipline that you practice. So you should also imagine that you are writing for someone who does not do the art form that you do. So if you are a filmmaker, don't assume that other folks understand what it takes, for example, to digitally transfer footage, and the amount of storage space, for example, that's needed on hard drives in order to store all your film footage. So what are the things that are unique about your discipline that someone outside of it might not know? Overall, with these applications, the panels are usually looking for more of like the fire in the belly or the passion and the vision than they are of looking for something that's like a perfectly sculpted, wordy, written application. So I always encourage folks to be as vulnerable as you feel comfortable being in terms of sharing some of your personal story, because we're really looking in the Transformation Award, since it's not project-based and it's looking at your practice overall over time, to have a sense of what it is that drives you and what it is that has made you into the artist that you are today that has this dedication to a social change practice. Another sort of general tip with approaching the Transformation Award is to try to resist the urge to cram everything in there. Some of you that I have talked to are doing many different types of art forms, or maybe doing just a lot of different projects all the time. And because you have limited space in this application, you may not be able to convey it all. So I encourage you to think about, if you were to just take a slice of what you do and give us a really clear focus on that particular part of your practice, that might strengthen your application so that it's not confusing for the panel to try to keep up with all the different things that you do. For these applications, one of the questions immediately if you're looking at the application in front of you is that you'll see that you're asked to pick your artistic discipline. We encourage you to not pick multidisciplinary unless you truly are multidisciplinary. And the reason for that is because it helps give a panel a sense of what you do if you pick something more specific. And so an example I will give is that a lot of dancers, for example, still work with video projection and music or sound design as part of their dance performance. So even though that's technically multidisciplinary in some way, your primary discipline is really as a dancer who's utilizing these other media elements. And so in that case, instead of picking multidisciplinary, I would encourage you to pick dance and performance. Performance. And then if you wanted to pick a secondary artistic discipline, you could add something else along with that. But thinking about what is your primary discipline, it doesn't have to capture everything that you do in your work, but kind of the core discipline that is at the root of what you do. The next thing you'll see in the application is that we ask you for your social change intent. And so this is a list of several different issue areas that you can pick from. You have to pick at least one. You can pick no more than 3. Now, some folks that I've talked to have said, well, I see on here that you have feminism and you also have racial justice. And for me, feminism inherently includes racial justice analysis. And I would agree with you. And so I want to encourage you to self-select on these. So you don't have to pick multiple ones. If you want, you could just pick feminism if you think that really is the core of your social change practice. And then in the application in question number 3, which we'll talk about in a little bit, you have an opportunity to define for yourself what those things, what that social change intent means to you. So this is really something that you're self-defining and self-selecting. And you can decide if you can capture that in 1, 2, or 3 choices from the list. The next thing you'll see on the application is the bio. This is meant to be 3 to 5 sentences to give us a general overview of who you are. This is usually the first thing that the panel sees, so it's kind of like your first entry, your first impression. And in this section, we want you to share who you are, what you do, where you do it, and who you do it with. So what kinds of communities are you working in? What formats are you working in? A little bit about the content of it, but this is not a place to get poetic or to go into more depth about your social change practice, because you're going to have more room in the actual application body to do that. So this should be clear and concise and direct and give us an overall sense of who you are and what you do. In the next section, you'll see what's called the experiences page. And this is a chance for the panel to get to know more about who you are and the various experiences that have shaped you over time to become the artist that you are today. This is not meant at all to be like a CV or a resume. And we actually purposely do not ask you for a resume because we value the other types of experiences that you might have that are just as crucial as a formal performance or formal training somewhere. And so you'll notice in the instructions that it says that you should do a combination of personal, political, and artistic experiences. And I really encourage you to try to have a mix of all of those things. And the personal things can be something like, if you are a media maker and you remember the first time that you saw someone who looked like you in the media and that was a formative moment for you that made you decide that you wanted to make films or television yourself. For these experiences, you'll notice that there is a column where it asks you for the dates of the experience. It doesn't have to be an exact date if it was a personal experience like that. So for example, you don't have to say it was on December 2nd of 1982 or whenever it was, but you can kind of just put a general date of when that experience happened in your life. Another example might be if you grew up, your parents were in the union and they were labor organizers, and so you grew up going to meetings, and that gave you a sense of what collective power could do when people come together. You could put that and then, put the years of your childhood that occurred. So thinking about formative moments in your overall trajectory throughout your life that have gotten you to the point where you are today to do the kind of artistic work that you do. If you put traditional accolades, like I got this award, or I performed at this place, or I was published here, try to add a little bit more about why that experience was important or significant to you. So, maybe in the first time that your work was recognized in a particular community, or it was the first time you got to collaborate with other folks in a particular way. So letting the panel know what was significant about that experience for you. You have to do at least 4 experiences, and you can do up to 10. I really encourage you for the Transformation Award, since this is looking at your sort of like your body of work over time, to use all 10 options and really just use this as a time for the panel to get to know you. Before I continue on with going through the application, I just want to pause for a moment again and say that if you have any questions as I'm talking about these, there are a few ways that you can get those questions to me. One is that you can, if you're on Twitter, you can tweet at us or use the hashtag #AskLeeway. Or you can email in a question at news, N-E-W-S, @leeway.org. And those questions will be relayed to me, and I'll be sure to answer them during the broadcast. So again, if you're just tuning in, we're focused right now on the Transformation Award application. And I'm going to start now in the body of the application with the 6 questions. So the first question asks for a description of your art for social change practice. In this question, we are looking at your work overall. So for cultural producers, it's like, or for cultural workers, it's what kinds of things do you do? For artists, it's what format do you work in? We want to know sort of when and how your practice started, why you do it, how has it changed, and where is it going, right? So I can give myself as an example. Before I was a program director here, actually was a transformation awardee. And in my application, I talked about as a filmmaker how I got my start working with a community organization when I was handed a camera and asked to document an event, and I started doing that more and more. And then I got really interested in doing documentaries, and I decided to go to film school and studied formally. And there's some things that were great advantages about that and some things that were difficult. But then talking about during that time how I transformed actually from documentary to doing fiction work and focusing more on the use of humor as a way to talk about social change issues. And then I talked about a little bit sort of the future projects that I'm working on right now that I'm hoping to achieve. So again, that is a brief summary, but it gives you kind of a sense where I talked about where I started, what the inspiration was, and where it's going. Question number one is just sort of looking at your practice overall. In question number two, it's asking for specific examples of your work. And so in this, you want to name things by title, if it's particular pieces of work. If it's a workshop series maybe that you did, you would talk about the sort of where the workshop was done and what it was called and what the content of it was. If it was like festivals or other cultural events that you put together, you would say the dates and the name of those occurrences. You want to give us particulars here. We need at least 2 examples. And you can add in as many more as you're able to fit. And one thing to think about as you're thinking ahead is if you are invited to stage 2 of the Transformation Award process, it is recommended that you provide work samples from some of the things that you listed there in number 2, because the panelists are going to be looking at your stage 1 and stage 2 applications together. And so they often are interested in seeing particular work samples from what you mentioned there in that stage 1 application. So you also want to think what kinds of things you might be able to give documentation of. So I just have a question that came in, which is for the description, I detailed what do you do, what's the format, how do you do it, where is it going, did I miss anything? And to that watcher that asked that question, no. So I can reiterate that again. For question number 1, we're looking at where or how your practice started, why you do it, how it's changed, and where it's going. So again, just to go back to my last thing on question number 2, you're giving specific examples of work. You're keeping in mind things that you can provide evidence of for work samples if you were invited to stage 2. In question number 3, this is where you're going to define the social change intent. And again, this was the list of sort of issue areas that you were asked to pick from. So this is where you would say, if you pick racial justice, to me, racial justice means X, Y, and Z. To me, feminism means this, that, and the other. And I think that one of the difficulties I see for some applicants in the past is that they assume a shared definition. And so they don't go into much detail here about what their social change intent or social change vision is for them. And if I picked 10 past Leeway grantees and put them at a table and asked them each what feminism or racial justice, for example, meant to each of them, they would have really different definitions. And that's just within Leeway's community of like a very narrow slice of past awardees. And in the world at large, of course, that would be even more variant. So Part of the reason that we're asking for you to define it clearly here in question number 3 is because the panel doesn't know you. And so they can't make the assumption about what your analysis or worldview or vision is. And so it's important to really lay it out in there. So the first part of the question is defining that social change intent. And then the second part is about how it shows up in your practice. So how is it embodied in the process of how you make the work? It might be who you collaborate with or the way that you approach your process. How is it embodied in the content of your work, like the actual content of what you're producing? And or how is that embodied in how you share the work? So what kinds of community centers or spaces are you choosing to share this work in? Or maybe it's on the streets, in a park in some sort of way. Why is that significant, and how does that reflect your social change vision? Question number 4 is asking you to define your community or communities based on a variety of different intersections of your identity. So it can be your education, gender, it can be geography of like what neighborhood in particular you're from. But we're asking you to identify how those different factors come together and as for how it influences your work. Right? So who are you? What are the different aspects of your identity, and how does this connect to your work? And then question number 5, it's continuing on that, asking what your relationship is to the audiences or communities that you work with, and how your identity, which you kind of just defined in the previous question, plays a part in this. So another way to think about this is the question of like, why are you the person to be doing this work? What are the unique intersections of your identity and the communities that you're a part of that position you for this work? And for those of you that are working in communities that you are not a part of, so this can be like a geographic communities that you're not working in your own neighborhood. It might be in terms of race or even in terms of age. So if you work primarily with youth and you're someone who's grown. And if you're working in a community that you are not a part of, this is also a place to identify how you are mindful of that. And so how are you acting as a bridge builder? Or how are you engaging folks in those communities, being an outsider in some sort of way? Question number 6 is asking you to describe the impact of your work. And so if you've ever done more traditional grant writing, you might think about impact in terms of numbers, because a lot of foundations are really just interested in the data, right? And for this application, if you have numbers and they're relevant to your artistic practice, you can absolutely show those and share those in your answer. But we are really looking at impact in the broader picture and thinking about social change as a slow process over time, and something that's difficult to measure. But how is the work that you're doing having some sort of impact in that larger process? So I recently have been reading a book by Jeff Chang that's called Who We Be, that I highly recommend. And Jeff is the co-founder of an organization called Culture Shift, perspective to Leeway on the role of culture in social change processes. And he uses this analogy to talk about impact that I find very interesting, which is that we often tend to think of, many of us, of social change as being a singular incident, right? Like a particular policy is changed, someone is cast in a major role in a film who never has been before, we elect a Black president, right? Like there's like this singular finite thing that we can define as like that is the change. But in most cases, there is usually decades of cultural work that preceded that change and worked to envision a new world and change people's hearts and minds to get our culture to the point where that change could happen. And so he uses the analogy of like that singular event is a wave that's coming into shore, right, on a beach. But in order for a wave to form in the ocean, there's hundreds of currents behind it that had to form and combine together to make that impact happen. And so if this analogy is useful, you might think about how is your work that you do one of those currents, right? What is the impact? Like, what's the wave coming to shore that you are imagining? Or what is the different world that you are imagining? And how is your work a piece of that movement that's going to create that impact? And then the other piece of this is that we're looking particularly in the Delaware Valley region. Because we are a regional funder, we are most concerned and interested with what is happening in Philadelphia and the surrounding 5 counties. And so you'll offer some of that bigger picture vision of what you imagine as impact, and then talk about it particularly here in the greater Philadelphia area of how you're embodying that. So what are ways that you're creating communities? What are ways that you're changing hearts and minds? What are ways that you're helping community organizations add a cultural element maybe towards a particular policy shift that they're trying to do? So it will vary from person to person what that impact looks like. But we want to see some sort of articulation of it here. Now, many of you have also done work nationally, which is important, and we commend you for that. But I would encourage you to resist the urge to feature that sort of national level work here, since we are a regional foundation. We're really looking for the local impact. So we have another question that has come in, and this person says, I missed the first part of question number 2. So this is going back to earlier in the application. It seems so straightforward, but when you say describe your work, can you please revisit briefly what is needed there? So going back again to question number 2, in the application, this is describing your art for social change work and providing specific examples. It is, in fact, as simple as it seems. Like, we're asking you to list a few specific examples of your work and providing descriptions of them. And so depending on what your artistic form or cultural work is, this could look different. But if you were a visual artist, for example, you might say, in my piece entitled X, this is what it looks like. You might talk about the scale of it, the color scheme, and then you might say a little bit about what kinds of places you exhibited it, or if you have a series of work that you did that was then displayed in community centers throughout the city, and there was conversations that happened together with those exhibits. You would talk about that series of work in the title, what was in it, and then a little bit about what happened with it. You need to have at least 2 specific examples there. And the thing that I had said is just making sure that it's something that you are able to document in some way. If you are invited to stage 2 of the Transformation Award, Leeway gives you a check for $100. And you are able to use that $100 towards the documentation of your work. So hopefully that answers your question, whoever asked that in the audience. But if you would like to message in again if that doesn't clarify for you. And again, for those of you just tuning in, you can ask questions either via Twitter by tweeting at us or emailing us at news@leeway.org. So I'm getting questions in. Apparently a couple of different people tuning in have asked if I would mind reviewing the definition of community for question number 4. So question number 4 again asks you to define your community or communities and what factors have led you to identify with or become a part of that community. So this can be a variety of different factors. We list some examples, but you can choose whichever ones resonate for you, and it may even be things that are not on this list. So examples of the kind of factors that could influence your identity with a particular community could be ability, education, geography, so your particular neighborhood or place that you grew up, your gender, your race, your religion, right? So what are all the different intersections of your identity experiences that have led you to identify with or become part of a particular community? It might be a community. So if it's not geographically based, it may also be that you're a part of a community of independent filmmakers, for example, using myself as an example. It might be that you were part of a community of educators, because being a teacher is a really big part of your identity. It's just thinking about the different groupings of people that you exist as a part of. And then the second part of this question is how that influences your work. So I can give myself as an example. Again, I come from, my family's from Iran. I come from a Muslim family, but I grew up mostly in the US South. But in Philadelphia, I live in the northwest part of the city, right? So I might talk about how different aspects of those communities that I'm part of all inform my identity. And my Art for Social Change practice involves making films that are really speaking to the experience of first-generation immigrants in the US, but in particular to Iranian American folks, and also looking at sort of the Islamophobia and xenophobia that exists that influences that experience. So how that looks and how you answer that question is be very different from person to person, but I hope that that example gives some guidance of what an answer might look like. Again, if you want to have more questions, you can email them in at news@leeway.org or tweet us. So that is the body actually of all the questions. So submitting this application, again, to prepare it, we're looking for your bio, those 10 experiences, and then these answers to the 6 questions. If writing it feels like a challenge for you when you're facing the empty page on your computer or on the paper, one thing I suggest to people a lot is if talking is easier than writing, to either sit down with a friend or colleague, or even you could talk to yourself also, and record yourself talking about what it is that you do. And then maybe you'll find some gems in there from your spoken thinking of it that you then can write down in your writing. Another tool that I think is helpful is that if you are feeling challenged by how to fit these answers in the limited space that is given to you, I often encourage folks like maybe overwrite first, write everything that you feel like you need to say and get it out on the page. And then ask someone to look over a draft and say, if you had to cut out 25% of this or 50% of this, what would you get rid of? And it's helpful to have that outside perspective from someone else of like what feels maybe a little less essential in your grant application that will help you pare down to fit the limitations. If you submit a hard copy of the application, those 6 answers have to all fit onto 2 pages. And you cannot go below an 11-point font. And I encourage you to keep in mind that there are humans that are going to be reading your application along with dozens of others. And so that if you are making your application in the smallest font possible and with the widest margins possible, you're really making it a challenging experience for that panelist to review your application. And so you want to keep it in a font that's easy on the eyes and follow the guideline formats. The format guidelines, sorry, for the application. If you submit the application online, each of those questions are in the online form and you have 1,400 characters per answer, which equals out roughly to 1/3 of a page for answering those questions. You also have limitations on the experiences where you can only do about 2 sentences for each experience, so figuring out a way to share those experiences in a concise way. Having someone review your application once you're done writing about it is highly recommended. If possible, I think it would be great if you can get someone who's less familiar with your creative work, so that they are reading it kind of with the fresh eyes that the panel will of not knowing a lot about the work that you do. Or it can be someone that knows what you do, but just make sure that they're really looking for how would someone read this who is encountering you for the first time and doesn't know who you are. As staff members, as I mentioned, we're not involved at all in the decision-making process, and we often see applicants who we know are out there doing the work and are really in a prime spot in their artistic practice for receiving this award, but because it's not conveyed in the application, the panelists aren't experiencing you in the same way that we are, for those of you that we have relationships with. And so it's really important to make sure that your full self is coming through in that application. We have a question that has come in that is, how experienced on average are past recipients of the Transformation Award? And that's a great question. It really varies. There's a misnomer out there that this award is only for people who are, 50 and above, or people who have been practicing for decades in some way or another. And that's not necessarily true, because the qualifications for this application is that you have to have been doing artistic practice for at least 5 years. And so we've had applicants in their 20s. Last year we had someone who got the award who I believe was 24, 25 years old, or thereabouts. And then, we've had people in their 70s get it who've been practicing since they were 24. So it really varies, but that 5 years is the minimum in terms of your experience. Again, we're just looking for that dedication and passion to your practice, as well as a clearly articulated vision for social change. And then the third part, which isn't as much in stage 1, but comes through more in stage 2 of the application if you're invited, is how this award would transform your life at this particular moment in your practice, right? So how is an investment from Leeway through awarding this grant really going to push you forward to be doing your work maybe in new ways, or taking care of yourself in different ways? As I mentioned, the award is unrestricted, so you can really use it for whatever you need to move forward right now. And so for some people, that has meant getting health things dealt with, get dental work because you've been in chronic pain and that's stopping you from moving forward. Some people have used the award to buy a house, to have that housing security. Someone's used it for a studio space, to buy a car, to pay off student loans so that they could work a little bit less and focus more on their artistic practice. So that's really up to you of what your vision is, but in the stage 2, you'll be asked to talk more about how that's going to be transformative for you at this moment. If you would like to receive feedback from a Leeway staff member, there's actually an opportunity this Monday, May 8th. We are going to be doing an applicant support session at the William Way Community Center, the LGBT Community Center that is at 1315 Spruce Street. So it's just a few blocks from the Leeway office. Myself and 2 other staff members will be there from 2 p.m. until 7 p.m. And you don't need an appointment. You can just show up anytime during that 5-hour period. And one of us will look over your draft of your application and give you feedback. So I encourage you, if that time and place works for you, to come take advantage of that, because very few foundations make their staff that available to give that level of feedback. And it's helpful, especially if you are kind of new to us and we don't know you that well, to get a sense of how to frame your work. And even for those of you that we know and have been in community with, it's a way to just make sure that you're really conveying the breadth of what you do and what we know about you in your application. So we're getting ready to wrap up soon. So I want to give one last chance if anyone else has any questions to email us at news@leewayorg, or tweet us on Twitter. I think I mentioned this before, but just to say again, everyone gets feedback whether or not you are awarded this award, and that is also a unique thing that not many foundations provide. And if you have applied in the past and gotten feedback, I encourage you to really incorporate that feedback in this new draft. But also keep in mind that the panel changes from year to year, so it's going to be a new group of artists that are looking at your application. So it might not be exactly the same things, but those recommendations will really help strengthen your application. So in that case, if there's no other questions right now, we'll go ahead and wrap up this broadcast, but please feel free to give us a call or email us if you have other questions that we didn't address. Again, if you'd like to come and get feedback on your application, you can join us on Monday, May 8th from 2 to 7 p.m. at the William Way Community Center at 1315 Spruce Street. So I hope to see you there. And if you are interested in our other grants, the Art and Change Grant or Window of Opportunity Grant, you can always call the office. We'll be doing another online live stream info session in July that will be focused on the August 1st Art and Change grant deadline. So thanks so much for tuning in. Thank you to our interpreter and the Deaf Hearing Communications Center. And hopefully we'll be seeing applications from you soon. Take care. Bye.